Hey, here's the latest edition of the On and Up Coaching Book Club podcast. This week, we are joined by Rachel Gaskell and Beth Moore, who've been on before, but welcoming new to the panel, Laurie Captain. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm Paul Gaskell. I'm the owner of On and Up Coaching, who are promoting these book club podcasts. One of the things we want to do with the podcast is to look at books that have influenced the sort of philosophy of On and Up Coaching. So we're going to review this week Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which I think distinguishes itself from the other books that we've looked at, in that Daniel Kahneman happens to be a Nobel Prize winning, he won the Nobel Prize for economics based on the work that's talked about in his book. And we want to dissect just a little bit kind of what he offers. And if you haven't read the book, hopefully we'll give you a reason to maybe pick it up and kind of understand what Daniel Kahneman's work is about. So I'm just going to share, before we get started, just a few kind of highlights about the book. So it was published in 2011. There have been at least 1 million copies sold. That might be quite understating it, because it is on the New York Times bestseller, was on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. Daniel Kahneman is an Israeli behavioral psychologist, as I said, won the Nobel Prize for economics for this work in 2002. I think some of the key ideas, which I think we'll touch on, are he's really strong on talking about these two different systems of thinking that we use in decision making. One is impulsive, quick thinking, intuitive, and the sort of second system, what he calls system 2, is a more deliberate, analytical mind, and that system 2 takes a lot more effort to kind of kick into gear, and we'll explore that, I'm sure, as we go along. And he explains how to take control of the two separate systems that can work in a way that help you when you need them to, so that if you're kind of making all your decisions intuitively, he would recommend some fixes based on his system 2 thinking. He also talks about some other ideas, and again, we might touch on some of these, about anchoring, the science of availability, if that's about availability of information, how we are very loss averse, and how framing of a message can totally influence how we decide. And then and one of his other concepts is the sunk cost fallacy. And again, I'm sure we'll touch on that. One thing I found fascinating, and I'll leave it with that, and then we'll get to the discussion, is that it's actually recommended reading for CIA officers, which, well, I think is very appropriate in the light of what we hopefully will discuss now. Okay, so first question. As you think about the book, which contains a ton of different ideas and a ton of different concepts, what are the ideas, approaches that resonate with you the most? And I'm hoping we're going to talk a little bit about system 1 and system 2, but don't let that constrain you. So I'm going to start with Beth this week.
I found it to be a little scary how, when we're in system 1, it's easy for us to have biases and fallacies that are created in our mind because we're going through this automatic, fast thinking type of thinking, which was developed, evolutionary wise, it kept us alive. But, and how I need to I feel like I need to be more, to recognize when I'm not really analyzing an idea or an issue in great depth, that I need to make sure that I'm just not quickly using that system 1 thinking and not thinking through the issue. And I guess it makes me realize that probably, because I'm doing so many things and multitasking all the time, that I'm probably in system 1 more than I should be.
Yeah, I think one of the things he talks about a lot that's negative about system 1. One of the things he talks about positively is that if you can kind of develop a skill like driving, for the most part, then you don't need kind of a lot of kind of what he calls system 2 kind of cognitive thinking, and you're able to do more things. So Laurie, I'm going to go to you.
I was going to say another interesting thing about system 1. And I apologize for the dog in the background, but another thing on system 1 is I recently read a book called Caste. And Caste was an anthropologist that did a study on the caste system in the United States based on race, and she compared that with India and their caste system, and also with Nazi Germany. And the interesting thing to me was as I was reading about System 1 and the fact that you've kind of got these almost automatic, autopilot, innate sort of, reactions to things, is what role that might play in some of the unconscious bias that we have when we're talking about the issue of race. So my mind immediately went to the System 1 thinking, and what role does that play in some of the race discussions or some of the race issues that we may have. So I kind of merged those two things together, and I thought it was an interesting kind of dynamic.
It talks a lot about different concepts like kind of how we use what information is available to us, which I think might play into what you're describing, where if someone is kind of predisposed to look at kind of race and caste in a certain way, then the information that tells them, they'll be selective about the information that tells them how to believe or how to think about the world. So that if I've got one negative example that I can consistently draw on that helps me support that frame of reference, then that's what I'll draw on, not on kind of a whole series of data points that might lead you to a different conclusion, and will be very System 2 thinking to go down that path. So Rachel, what resonated with you the most?
Well, it's funny that you asked Beth that question, and I was thinking about your answer, and much similar. I feel like each of the ideas built upon themselves, but for me, the foundation was what I keep getting stuck with is System 1 versus System 2. And really what it is System 1 being that fast automatic approach versus that slow logical approach. And I liked it when they said, the fast approach is something that happens to you, like your amygdala, warning, fire, run. But the slow logical is something that you do, and that it can be lazy, so you have to force yourself into it. But the impression that I got looking at the totality of all of these ideas, I felt very vulnerable because I felt like the brain is more predictable than I thought. And being, studying math, and solving problems professionally. I always think that there's always a possibility, there's always a solution, there's multiple ways to approach it. But reading this and listening to all of his ideas, I fear that we're more predictable as a society, and perhaps that's what gives him that edge in terms of using behavioral science with economics. It was interesting, and I'd like to disprove that because I want to think that we are more thinking evolved. That may not be something I can do in tonight's episode, however.
So that will be the next question. But there's one thing I found really interesting when I was kind of went back and was looking at some of my notes about the book, and it talked about how much we value how things are stated. So if we're getting like a political message, say we might be getting a political message right now that supports the kind of what we believe in, then we'll go for that framing of the situation every time. But the one kind of nuance to it is, which I think is a part of this, is like how do you use System 2 to help balance your decision making? Is that those less involved in a particular topic, say climate change, are more likely to be susceptible to information that's not well supported or is easily. So one of the messages around climate change has been it's going to be really expensive to make changes to the way we deal with the environment. We can't afford it, and that resonates very much with people who don't support climate change. And they don't generally know much about kind of the other facts because they found their frame, and that's what they're going to stick with. So
yeah, that was very interesting. They said it was the perfect storm, wasn't it? Because climate change is both distance. It's not going to happen to us tomorrow. It's going to happen to us in well, that's arguable, but let's say in a generation. It's abstract. So in some ways it's difficult to measure or difficult for people to hold that, but it's also can be contested. And in that case, we are not as a society all able to rally around the same situation, which is if there is an asteroid coming to hit us in a week from now. It's measurable, it's immediate. So I thought it was very interesting, something that is probably going to affect us in its totality, and it is not. Sorry, I think I got frozen, but anyway, I thought that was very interesting.
So I'm going to go back to the question you started to pose to yourself a few moments ago, which is there anything that particularly surprised you about the ideas, and or maybe something that you would want to question? And I don't think we need clearly we're not going to develop a thesis or anything to kind of question, but he has pointed out that he worked with somebody who disagreed with his conclusions about how the value of intuition. So maybe that's a leading question, but what is it that you'd like to disprove, if you could?
Who would you like to go first?
I was going back to Rachel because she had posed the question.
Oh, Rachel. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I don't know the answer to this question. I'd like to disprove that I don't have the answer to every question. I was more prepared to talk about the memory component. You know, I don't know. I struggle with this question. I really do.
Yeah.
I think our egos would like to disprove that we think as much as we do with our system one self. and think more with our system two. Although system one has a very valuable purpose, we probably over rely on that as a species, and we would probably be better served to rely on our system two self.
Yeah.
You know.
I think for me, framing as well is something that I'd like to disprove. So when they gave the scenario where a doctor comes in and says, you're about to have a surgical procedure, you have a 10% probability of dying, versus the same scenario with a doctor coming in saying you have a 90% probability of living, how you process that differently. And I don't know about you, but as a mother, you know, you often say, don't do this. And the first thing the child wants to do is the thing that you said, don't do. So you always try to frame it the other way. I would like to think that as adults, if someone said that to us again, we'd be a little bit more evolved in our ability to respond. So I would almost like to disprove the impact of framing. As you get older, you become more of a thinking person and you move away from the amygdala and into kind of the prefrontal cortex. But I don't know what data you would use to disprove that.
I use framing on a daily basis. I do some training. I do training for executives on how to present an idea, concepts, you know, and I use framing. That's one of the foundations. It's all in how you frame it. So I'll ask them to talk about a topic, and then I'll, you know, cut them off at some point and go, I wouldn't start with that, or I wouldn't lead with that, or and you know, and I kind of make the point that how you begin to introduce a topic or a concept or an idea or a point of view is really important. And if you don't get that right, it can impact your ability to be successful if you're trying to persuade someone or you're trying to inspire someone, or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. That framing at the front end is very important, and it requires some thought and some, you know, thoughtful approach. So
do you use the thinking, the ideas that he puts forward about how we're really kind of programmed to avoid loss? So we'll go to kind of illogical lengths to avoid things that cause us to lose. But on the other hand, people will seek out kind of positive gain. So you can't present both those messages, right? Because basically people won't do something because they want to avoid the loss.
Yeah. I work in a scientific field, and I work with engineers and chemists, and everything's based on data, and trying to help them to understand that that's not how you pose, that's not how you present information to the general public, to a consumer.
Yeah.
And it's that loss avoidance, or that risk, you know, and part of the issue is risk reward. A lot of times, you know, might be very little risk, but there's also no reward. so why should I take any risk if there, if there's no reward? And that sometimes can be a very difficult concept to explain to scientists. So framing is important, and loss avoidance is absolutely, again, I'm not going to take any risk if there's not any significant reward. It comes back to the dollars that they talked about in the book, where $1,000, but if it was a big gain and a small loss, you're more willing to take the risk.
Yep.
So.
Yeah. So that you start with presentations that you have a 10% chance of dying as a result of my work. Is that the?
No.
No.
Our presentations that we would go more generally to the positive, unless your goal is to scare people.
Well, I was just imagining where they might start before you finished,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
skilling them, though.
Yeah.
Okay. So Beth, what disprove sounds like a strong word, but what would you like to believe in a slightly different way? How about that?
Well, I'm a little concerned about knowing these different big ideas that come out of this book, how you could easily manipulate people through, knowing about the framing and their, people's loss aversion and this, and also repeatedly showing your message over and over and over again and influencing their choices in life. It's very powerful. If this is true, it's very powerful, especially when it comes to advertising and also politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I think quite a lot of the stuff that he talks about, it kind of when he's done kind of different presentations, we keep losing you, I think, Beth.
Sorry.
When he talks about presentation, when he presents, he talks a lot about kind of political discussions and how easy it is to kind of give people a sense that they, where their decision should lie. If you kind of know enough about this stuff. I don't think it's him, but I did read somewhere actually that the Allstate commercial, which uses the mayhem character, is firmly based on the priming portion, which kind of helps our system one think in a certain way. So I don't know your reaction to the commercial, but what it's intended to do is to make people very afraid of not having insurance.
It's effective. It's definitely effective.
So
it's interesting in the political discussion.
I cried during commercials.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that the tribalism that you're seeing, right, in this, particularly in this presidential election, where people are in their camps and they only listen to what, they only hear what they agree with, and they disregard anything that they, that's different. So how do you think some of these concepts play into that I accept this and I disregard that and I'm entrenched? Because that's what it feels like in this political environment.
So he does provide answers about how I, as an individual, kind of start to recognize that these things could happen to me, and that I take a more kind of deliberative, informed kind of approach, which is let me look at all of the information that supports this. So if maybe climate change is maybe one of the least controversial, but you kind of go and read what people who've studied this field or experts in this field, so that your opinion isn't, it's less susceptible to one person's, if we do that, it's going to cost a lot of money. You kind of look at it more in its totality. I do confess, and Rachel said this to me before we started recording, that he says, Kahneman, that he's a pessimist and that he doesn't want to look to the future because he's frightened about what it might mean. And I think some of it comes from, there's a lot of system ones out there having a lot of arguments with themselves about kind of where we are. That doesn't sound very optimistic, does it?
No, but the concepts in the book, you can apply them to a lot of the speculation about how voters are thinking and how their behaviors are evolving. And there was one interesting podcast I was listening to during a walk from The Daily, and they talked about how Trump was so successful in winning over so many working class in the Pennsylvania area specifically. And it was less about the messages and more about how he made them feel. And they felt disenfranchised from what had become in their minds this elite Democrat Party. But all of a sudden, this individual came in and said, I see you. And so the story talks about how they felt they weren't ashamed to be who they were. And so it was about how they felt with Trump, even though he was a wealthy man from New York. And we could argue all of those points. But in many ways, that for me is about system one. And then the concept of framing, because then Trump goes on to say, I'm going to bring jobs back to America. It's providing sort of what they're looking for. So in many ways, you can take the concepts of this book and start to unpack the propaganda that is sort of the Trump machine. And it's interesting that way. And in many ways, you have to stop the cycle if you're going to change the message and how it lands.
Yeah. Or make this compulsory reading in every school in America. Maybe that would be
Great idea.
at least some of the concepts, right? So, okay, we're going to wrap it up with final question. So for anyone listening to this who hasn't read the book, what's the one thing that you'd want them to know? And that could be the thing you enjoyed the most, the thing you might do differently or do more of tomorrow, something you'd apply in a work setting, or something you might want to do with your kids. Let's start with Beth.
Well, I think that for me, it talks about this book, it encourages you to have as many life experiences, understanding all these different cultures, to keep yourself from being too much in system one, by understanding, like, if you just stay within your small little community, you're going to have very extreme biases, and you're going to be in system one, and you're going to do things on like an automatic way, when if you keep exploring the world and exploring people and exploring ideas, that will keep you more in system two, and you won't fall into those the fallacy and biases tendencies of system one.
Actually, for me, it harks back to what we talked about with the growth mindset, where it's not that you are growth, you've got a growth mindset or you haven't. It's kind of situational, and it's recognizing that kind of those situations, especially where for you system one prevails, and that might not be the most helpful set of kind of thought processes. He says, speaking personally. So Laurie, what's your takeaways?
I think that for me, I recognize a lot of these different sub areas, anchoring and loss aversion, that they elicit emotions, right? You have an emotion, and it's driving your thoughts or your behavior. And so for me, I think the concept is, you're going to feel the emotion. Can you stop yourself? Can you take a minute and be a little bit more deliberate and try to think, okay, I'm feeling threatened, or I'm feeling scared, and why, and what's behind that, and is, should I be exploring, the logic behind that as I'm forming an opinion or expressing a point of view. And so it's I guess the concept of trying to be a little bit more deliberate in your thought process, and not just react to what you're feeling at a given moment.
Yeah, probably the situation and time of day make a big difference as well. Because he I don't know if the examples in the book, but I've heard him talk about this experiment where you ask somebody to remember 7 digits, and then they get asked, do they want chocolate cake or a healthy snack? And invariably people say chocolate cake. Whereas in an experiment where you're not trying to remember 7 digits, there's much more of a split about who chooses what. So it's you can be aware also of how much you can control at one point in time.
Weight Watchers has really picked up on that. They really have. They're like, make sure that when you're making your choices about food, you're not being distracted by something else.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, there's some science behind that as well. So Rachel, final word. What's the one thing that you'd want people to know about the book?
I just want to say again that I've waited my whole life to have the final word. So I just want to thank you for that. No, in all seriousness, I loved the idea of the mind or the self. So the experiencing self versus the remembering self. And what I thought was so fascinating is the story or the question about different families were asked if they had a choice between going on a very expensive, luxurious vacation, but are not allowed to take pictures, versus those that could take a reasonable vacation, but they can take pictures. You know, what do you experience a vacation versus how you re-experiencing it by remembering it through photographs. So I think my aha moment is take as many photographs as you can so you can continue to experience it, not in the moment, but afterwards.
I don't recall that experiment, but that sounds so. The one thing I would say, I would leave it with is there's a lot out there on YouTube where he's being interviewed by all sorts of people, and in fact, he's in I think the 100th episode of the Hidden Brain podcast.
That's where it was from. Yeah.
Ah, okay. And the I think a guy whose name I can't remember now from Hidden Brain, he said that the first 99 episodes were as influenced by Kahneman's work as anybody else. So. For that reason alone, you should at least check out the Hidden Brain podcast. But a lot of great stuff. We're going to close it there. Thank you very much for joining me, Rachel, Laurie, Beth. Good to see you this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for your contributions. We'll hopefully see you next time.